I enjoy history, so it's not hard for me to get excited for things like this, but I realize not everybody enjoys history. But I think if we adjust our perspectives, we can all have a meaningful day and all have a meaningful time of reflection. And one of the reasons why I enjoy history is because history involves stories about people like us who had dreams and fears and all kinds of life experiences. And so people naturally like good stories. Seems like the best movies, some of the best books are written about true stories. And so we have much to learn from, too, and to benefit by listening to the journey of others. A wise person learns from experience, and a wise person also learns from the experience of others. So we can certainly benefit, too, from the stories and from the lives of those who've gone before us and can better appreciate even who we are and God's calling in our lives as we understand the context that we've been birthed in and that God is at work in. I also find history interesting because there often are mysteries to solve. And people commonly like a good detective show, and you can also find many mysteries in history. And oftentimes we understand little bits and pieces, but have a harder time putting the puzzle together. And it can be exciting when you put the puzzle together and when the pieces start fitting and you start seeing the big picture of what's happened in years before us and how God's been at work and the different things that have happened. So some of the things I've been thinking about these last number of weeks and months as I've been looking at pictures is looking at the people who've gone before us and thinking about their lives and what life was like for them. And even for me, as I look back at some of the old pictures and things, it kind of initially found it hard to relate to some of these people who look differently than we do now and who had different technology and life was different for them. But the more I kind of dug around a little bit and heard prayer requests and heard ministry things, and the more I appreciated and the hearts of the people who've gone before us. And it's ultimately, too, because of the people who've gone before us that we can be here today. And so we have Jesus in common with them, too. So as long as we have Jesus in common with former generations, we have a lot in common with former generations. But as I've been thinking and looking at pictures and thinking about stories, I've been thinking, too, about Allensville and how we came to exist in the first place. And we have a slide show here and a PowerPoint with some pictures on so we can celebrate 150 years of ministry. And I started even thinking about things like where did we come from, who were the people, what was previous buildings like. And there's one picture of, many of you know that this isn't the original building, and that the original building would have been over there towards the Belleville side of us. And there's a picture from 1949 where two buildings were beside each other. And so anyway, that gives us a little bit of an overview of the buildings, but the church is certainly a lot more than just buildings. But in June 25th, 1869, a group of people purchased land that the building now stands on, and kind of found an old survey of that land, and that road was called the Great Road. Before it became Route 76, I guess it was just the Great Road, and then it became Route 76 and eventually 655. So but yeah, it's a great road with tar now on it, but now we're getting sidetracked. So, but yeah, as we think back and too of what God has been doing, and I think about some of those original people, they bought some land in 1869. So if they bought land in 1869, they must have been in existence before 1869 as a group of people, and the details are still a little fuzzy for me, but perhaps around 1861, 1863, there was a group of people who broke off from the Amish, and basically the ancestors and the people who started this church called themselves Amish Mennonite. And here's a picture, and I'm not sure what date this was. There's a little bit of snow in the foreground, and you probably can't read the sign above the building, but there's a sign above the building that says Allensville AM Church, and so it stood for Allensville Amish Mennonite Church. I don't know when it switched to just Allensville Mennonite Church. Does anybody know about when that switched? Okay. Maybe somebody else will get up who will talk later will be able to explain that. But at some point, it was switched from the Allensville AM, Amish Mennonite Church, just to Allensville Mennonite Church. I don't know exactly when that happened. But anyway, the group of people were in existence before 1869, so we probably should have celebrated our 150th some time ago, because we existed as a community before even 1869. But yeah, I think it is interesting to look at two people. We have pictures here of some of the earlier buildings, but we also have some pictures of people, because the church, by definition, is a group of people collected to centered around Jesus, to worship Jesus. And so this is one photo of some of the people. There's a couple other people in front of the church building, and that photograph is dated 1906. And the people there were Levi Esch, Elmer Glick, Linda Roth, and son Clarence, Rachel Esch, and Catherine Zook. And yeah, you can see Clarence, who I believe was Nelson's grandfather, if I have that right. But you can see he's dressed kind of almost differently than what little boys would be dressed like now anyway. And yeah, and there's an arrow too pointing to a railing. You can see it's kind of like a wooden sidewalk or something that the carriages would have crossed into there. This was 1906, so even if there were cars, there weren't many, and everybody would have came to church in a carriage. And you can see too, there's a platform there with a railing. And so it looks like you don't see a lot of gravel there. It must have been pretty muddy. So I imagine that when they came to church on a Sunday morning, the carriages would have pulled up beside that platform there and just unloaded right there. And that railing looks like you could have people walking on either side of it. And so they probably had the women and the children get off there, and the men probably parked the horse and buggy somewhere else in the carriage shed or wherever, and came back to the building. And there's another picture of the same building. And there it's from the same view, but you can see that the little platform is gone there. And there's also a couple little windows. And so that must have been after 1912, because the basement was put in 1912, and in 1932 an addition was made. This was still the original church building, so it was sometime between 1912 and 1932. And then here is some more people. Young folks in 1907 at the Elrose Hartzler Farm. They had a party in January the 1st, so it's interesting again looking back at people and seeing how they dress, looking inside their homes. Some of the details are probably hard for you to see. There's a little, deer head there hanging too, so somebody was hunting. And here's another picture where includes the names, another slide that includes the names of the people on the picture. I'm sure some of you may ring a bell with those names, and others of you probably don't know any of them, but there's a number of people listed there. And here is some expenses from 1912, so we get a little glimpse into what they were spending their money on. Again, a basement was dug out underneath the old church building in 1912, so some of these expenses were for the addition of a basement in 1912, and it was a couple $100. It looks like it added up to, but a couple $100 certainly then aren't what it is now. So there's $53 about for siding, $55 for pipes and fittings. So the pipes and the fittings cost more than the siding did and the lumber did. And there's some carbide. It says 100 pounds of carbide. I'm not sure if that's right or not. That's what it says in the book. But they were buying cans of carbide later on. You see in the book of expenses that there was common for them to purchase cans of carbide. And so I was figuring out what cans of carbide are, and it must have been used for lighting or something. I talked to Jim Price, and he said that when he was a young boy, they would stick a hole in the bottom of a can of carbide. You could buy it at the hardware store, and they put a wick to it and light it and run. He said it was better than fireworks. So anyway, it had some explosive nature to it, and they were putting it in the lamps here probably for lighting. But those are some of the details that, we can't go to the hardware store and buy carbide anymore. So, and there's some income, too. There's a book in the foyer that has income and expenses from 1912 through 1922, and most often it's about one page for income and one page for expenses. So the treasurer's job was a little bit easier then. They didn't have weekly offerings. They actually had taxes. So we had tax collectors, and the treasurer's job was to go to collect taxes. And so we had tax collectors in the church. And you can see George B. Yoder, whose, again, grandson is here today. He was a tax collector, treasurer, and at one point there, his tax from 1913 was recorded at $28.45. And the income for 1914 there fits on a slide. You can see at Thanksgiving, they must have taken an offering, and then the rest were taxes there. But so for quite a while, it seems like offerings were taken on Thanksgiving, and that was about the only time. And then, again, you had a church tax for expenses. Pastors weren't paid. There wasn't much other way in way of expenses, and so it was certainly life was more simple then, and less time paying bills. There's a picture of some young people from 1915 at Brady's Mill. I think it's interesting, too, just how they're dressed there. You can see the guys have ties on, and two of the guys have bow ties, and eventually that would become taboo, too, in the church. And somewhere I was reading about how Ron Peachy wore a bow tie in the 50s, and he was the first song leader who wore a bow tie for a long time. So sometime before 1920, people dressed like this, and around 1920, someone in Kansas started emphasizing more conservative dress, and that came east. And so then in Big Valley, people started dressing, Mennonites started dressing more conservatively as well. But before 1920, you can see they dressed pretty much like anyone else in their day. And yeah. And there's, this picture is probably before 1922. He has a tie on, and he has a cow, and the description there says Daddy with a cow, Blayrocker. I'm not sure how to say the name, but anyway, I thought the dairy farmers would appreciate that. It must have been a good cow for them to take a picture of it, and yeah, so it may have been one of the Esches. I'm not sure exactly who that was there in that photo. Just another picture of the old building, which many of you have seen before, and here, too, is another photo of the original building. They keep putting fences around. You can see the fences changed over time, and if you look at the expenses, you can see they were buying fence and replacing the fence at different times. And there's a carriage shed there, too, right along Route 76. And talked to a number of older people who said, I don't remember a carriage shed being there, but here's a picture, too, of another carriage shed right facing this way and the Esch building, the Esch house would have been behind it. So anyway, there's just some of the details, some of the things that have come and gone and changed with time. And there's a picture, too, of the building in 1932, and the addition that was put on in 32, 18 feet was added to make more space as the church was growing. So Darlene is going to talk at this time a little bit about the conference of 1939. It was a big deal for the Valley, and she'll fill in some details from that.
Well, thank you, Sherman, for helping out in that early history. I am representing the SALT class, is a group of young adults that Ben and I are a part of, and this is the time period that we were assigned. So my information comes from the Mennonite County Amish and Mennonite Story by S. Dwayne Kaufman. We didn't have people to talk to. We needed to go to books to find our information about this time period. I do want to make note that the 1939 conference was not the first one held in the Valley. There was one in 1927, and it was adjoining the Belleville Mennonite Church. So would that be Maple Grove now, I assume? Okay, that was the first one. And then the Mennonite Central Conference chose Big Valley for meeting again in 1939. So these are just some pictures of them putting up the tent and what the overall, what it looked like as they were doing that. So in 1939, this place that was very impressive too. The meetings were held in a 12-acre cornfield, and much of the area was reserved for parking, 2,000 automobiles. At one corner was a campground for the tents and house trailers of visiting families. The central feature was the large tent, which seated 3,500 under its cover. With extra chairs and benches around the outside perimeter, a total seating capacity of 5,500 was reached. And then another large tent was used for cafeteria, and smaller tents served as the headquarters for various supporting departments. I had to wonder what happened if a storm came up during this time. I don't know. Maybe they all ran somewhere. I don't know. So in the next few slides, I put together what I call tidbits from the conference. The first one is some things that they talked about. Monday and Tuesday gave attention to Christian education, Sunday school, music, youth, and Mennonite history. And then on Wednesday, the day was devoted to topics related to the first conference as was described in Acts 15. On Thursday, addresses were given on the current theme of war and the non-resistant way of life. And during all this time, there were also many messages preached to from various, invited ministers that came in to speak. And then the next one is attendance. It would have been estimated at 8,000, but 6,500 was probably more accurate. And the ordained registrants that were there, 74 bishops, 201 ministers, and 58 deacons. The next one then would be the meals. Well, on that one, the meals were 20 cents. So for 20 cents, this is what you got at the noon meal. A large tin of ham and bean soup, bread, butter, and apple butter, crackers, pepper slaw, peach, banana, cookies, pies, and coffee. That was one of the meals. And then the next slide shows that there were 250 gallons of veal pot pie. A whole beef was used to make a whole beef used to make 300 gallons of beef and noodle soup, and then 90 to 100 gallons of coffee. Also, I wanted to put in there that there were large steam vats of 400 to 500 gallons capacity were used, so that gives you an idea of how they cooked that much stuff at one time. And then 12 serving tables with 10 waiters per table. The entire group was served in under 30 minutes. So those had to be long tables. If you had 10 waiters and it was served, it wasn't cafeteria style. So I thought that was really interesting. I do want to read a little bit then from the book. Of course, when you have something this big, there are different people look at it different ways. So after this conference, a Gospel Herald editor wrote, "The hospitality was all we expected, and we have experienced a great deal remembering how we fared when General Conference was at Belleville 12 years ago. Whenever a meeting of this kind is held in the Big Valley, you may expect all the people of the Kishkaquillis Valley from one end to the other to give it a hearty support. So then, here's the opposite side of that. The same analyst was less enthusiastic, or somebody was less enthusiastic about the congregational singing during the occasion, which he described as being a type that reminded one of a runaway team rather than a spirit of worship that belongs in a community of believers." So I'm thinking, okay, maybe half of as song leaders, you can relate to this. Half of the people in the tent were singing, the other half were trying to catch up, or whatever, and so it sounded like runaway horses. That's the only thing I can understand. And then he scolded, now this might still be us, he scolded the promenaders who distracted the audience by their constant wandering and visitation. Yeah, so maybe they weren't getting anything out of it and decided to visit instead and find their relatives, I don't know. So in the conference of 1927, the big the big thing that happened during that was the use of the microphone. Okay, that was very new in that time period. In this time period, it was new, people arrived by airplane, and so that was very new for this time. They came into the valley with the assistance of local aviators, S.L. Burke and Harvey Hostetler, and some of you may know those. So, and this was interesting to me, I think. In commenting on the development, a local reporter in an article, it was titled, "People Not Backward, Fly to Meeting." And that was observed it was observed that though the Mennonites were separated from the world in dress, their principle of non-resistance and other beliefs of a simple faith, they were keeping abreast of the times in many respects. So we were moving along with the times when it came to something like that. In all my, in looking at all this early history, I think the conclusion that I would come to, one of the strong threads that has been going on from the time that we're looking at till now, has been the thread of missions. And we heard that last night from people that talked of how involved Allensville was in missions and still is today. And so I appreciate that about this church. It was started, we did many things that you might hear from other people, going out to start churches and Bible schools that people went to, and just the continuation of the missions. And I would call that one of the strong threads of our church today. One of the messages that was preached at the conference was a D.D. Miller, and he apparently preached a stirring message, "Ye shall be witnesses." And isn't that what we are told to do today? It's still true. You shall be witnesses. So I appreciated looking into this time of period. I probably wouldn't have done it wouldn't have had to, but it does, it's interesting. And to remember that these were people just like us. And so, thank you.
Well, thank you, Darlene. And we're just going to focus on the 40s and the 50s just by kind of looking at some pictures kind of rapidly here. Here's one picture from Winter Bible School in 1947. Winter Bible School was a big deal for the Valley and for Allensville. And later on, tonight we'll mention briefly Winter Bible School from 1914. But they were well attended, and you can see there's a variety of ages of people there, and something that the community certainly valued at that time as well. So in the 40s, while Winter Bible School was one of the activities that was happening, there also was, again, the brick building that we're in today was constructed. And around 1948, 1949, you can see there's a picture of a dump truck there. So if you're a kid here and you like construction, you can relate. See, they had what the dump trucks used to look like then. And there's another picture of, the dump truck working, and they found a way to get things done. They may not have had nail guns and whatever, but they found a way to get stuff done. And you can see, that's the sanctuary would have looked like a little while ago. So it doesn't look like that now, but you can see the basic framing there is what's here today. And you can see the brick building is just slightly to the right of the white building there that's still standing. And again, that would eventually come down. And there's some pictures of it being torn down. And here's just a couple pictures from the 50s. You can see the cars in the parking lot look a little differently than what's out there today. But they were bringing people to worship God and to serve Him together. Another picture with the sign here, Welcome Allensville Mennonite Church. So certainly by the 50s, it wasn't Amish Mennonite anymore, and obviously the transition to Mennonite had happened. And then here's a picture in the 60s that was shown last night, and you can see the people there. It was the junior sewing circle. You can see Pauline is kind of seated facing in the bottom here, and then going around from Pauline would be Verda, Janice, Esther, Audrey, and Naomi. And so it was an activity, again, that was valued and is still valued today. And that leads us to a transition to the 60s, when all kinds of things changed in the 60s, didn't they? And we look forward to having Nelson share with us in the 60s, and then Verda and Byron will come up too as well and give some reflections too. So if Nelson would come, and then after Nelson's done, if Verda and Byron would come up, and then after them, Jim will tell us about the 70s.
I'm grateful to be here this morning and reflect on 6 years that I was a member of Allensville Mennonite Church during the 60s. And just the other evening, Emma Jane asked me, "What are you going to do tomorrow?" I said, "I'm going to get ready for Sunday." She said, "I thought you knew what you wanted to say." I said, "Yes, but I'm still trying to figure out how to put it all in 5 minutes." Emma Jane and both of my parents grew up here in Allensville Mennonite Church. And I worked here on George Hartzler's farm for 7 summers up at the county line. And after I graduated from Eastern Mennonite College, Emma Jane and I were married here on August 23, 1963. There were a number of couples planning for weddings at that time during the month of August, and we finally were able to reserve a Friday night that was open, and it was just the day before Ken and Doris Peachy were going to have their wedding the next day. So we had to get cleared out so they could come in after our wedding reception and have their rehearsal. Emma Jane and I had a week for a honeymoon and move into our apartment above Musser's Bar in Burnham. I didn't frequent the bar, but Emma Jane did. Let me finish. We were on 3rd floor, and every Friday she would take our $17 check down to pay our rent for the next week. And the men who worked at Standard Steel were either coming to work or leaving work, and were there and staring at this conservative Mennonite girl who come down there wondering why she was there, I guess. But our $17 rent included water, heat, and we paid the electricity, I think. So that was a good deal. And I began teaching school the next Monday at East Derry Elementary School, and we lived in Burnham for a year, and we drove from Burnham to service here on Sunday morning, back again Sunday evening. We came Wednesday evening, and anything else that was going on in the church. And so Sunday morning here, there was an audience of probably around 400. I think the board up here said that the enrollment is 425, something like that for a while. And so there were 20 classes here in the auditorium, 10 on this side with men, 10 on this side with the women, and they staggered back and forth the benches the whole way back. And if you got bored listening to your Sunday school teacher, you could just tune into the one next to you. I don't know if anybody ever did that, but and as we heard last night, the young people would sit up here at the front. They would march out to their classes up behind the pulpit here and come back in, and the children did the same thing. We sang in parts from the church hymnal, and the young boys sat with their fathers over here, and the young girls sat with their mothers over here, and that's the way they learned to sing parts. And so that was good. Emma Jane was children's superintendent before we were married, and a short time afterwards. And there were 125 children in the basement at that time. And they had pool curtains, and nobody talked about that we ought to add on or build more space or anything else. I guess they didn't know that we would need it. But I was thinking, if they would have done it then, it would have been a lot cheaper, and we could have the benefit now. So the next spring, after we were married, in 1964, why, I got a letter in the mail one day from a deacon's wife in Maryland, and she said, we need a pastor at our church, small church, rural church, and she was also a public school teacher in that area, and it was a 2-room school. And she said, we're going to need a teacher next year for the upper grades. And if you come and teach school, why, you can support yourself so that you can be pastor of our church. And so that's the way we did that at those times. But before we had time to pray about it, Bishop Raymond Peachy called on the phone and said, Ethel and I would like to come in and visit you this evening. And so we said, okay. And he came and he said, the Allensville Church Council has been discussing and agreeing that we would recommend to the congregation that you would be licensed as a minister here and be associate pastor with Elrose Hartzler for 1 year. And so that kind of helped us decide about the Maryland call. And so that was approved, and I was licensed here, and I preached the next Sunday after I was licensed. I didn't even go to seminary. But anyway, that was for a year, and then, but I was only age 24, and I remember after the first Sunday that I preached here, there were some visitors here from Eastern Mennonite College that I knew well, and they were sitting back here in the back, and afterwards they said they could hardly keep from laughing because they couldn't believe me up here preaching a sermon. And so anyway, Raymond Preachy also was bishop, even though he was an active pastor at that time. And he arranged that the 3 of us would visit 1/3 of the families here at Allensville in the next year. And so we all had a list of who the families were that we were to visit, about 25 or 30, I think, for each of us. And so in 3 years, we had visited all the families of Allensville Mennonite Church. And I was teaching school full-time. I was visiting at the hospital. I was preaching every other Sunday. I was working with the membership class every Sunday for a period of time until they were baptized. And I was also teaching Wednesday evening. We had about 25 young people that came for Bible study on Wednesday evening. And I was also the minister representative with the MYF, which was Mennonite Youth Fellowship. And as you heard last night, they worked with the Rockville Church too. And so I also went to summer school for 3 summers. And when I went to summer school, I would come home Wednesday afternoon after the last class and prepare for the study for Wednesday evening. And then Thursday morning, I'd go back again and be there till Friday afternoon, and then come home for the weekend, spend time with the family, prepare for Sunday, try to catch up on what's going on, mow the lawn, all those things that you do on a weekend. And so we bought a home on Maple Grove Road, and a couple weeks later, our first child was born the day before our first anniversary. When I was minister here, why, they the ministers didn't have a salary. They had a love offering. A love offering was how much you loved the pastor, that's how much you put in. That's not all fiction either. And and so the fifth Sunday offerings were the love offering Sunday, and it was designated for different pastors. And then a year or so later, they decided to divide it up and not designated which pastor was for. And you can figure out how that works. And so then we had 1/3 of the fifth Sunday offering for that period of time. A year later, I was ordained, continue here at Allensville, and a month after I was ordained, our second child was born, and I enjoyed pastoral ministry. I grew up in a pastor's home with Paul and Beatrice Roth at Masontown, and Paul Roth was one of the best pastors. He was well known. He did Bible school at Maple Grove Church for a number of years. He was at Masontown for 31 years, and our bishop at Masontown, and who had been a former pastor there for 10 years, said at one point that Masontown Church and the pastor was Exhibit A in the Mennonite Church. That was quite a compliment. And so I grew up learning that model, but that model wouldn't have worked for my father here at Allensville, and it didn't work very well for me either. After 5 years as associate pastor, the vote wasn't high enough for me to continue. There was favoritism among the pastors. There was tension over my being too involved. A few persons in the congregation who wore neckties insisted that I wear a plain coat for all services, even though I was teaching school and would come home and come Wednesday evening and have a necktie on. So the Lord led us to Martinsburg for 31 years. And I pastored 2 Mennonite churches there. And the Paul Roth model was effective, with much response and involvement from the community, and I was still teaching full-time. When I left here is when Paul Bender began to be full-time pastor, and 3 years later, a group divided and started Bethel Congregation with Elrose Hartzler as their pastor. Just a quick note, after Paul Bender had been pastor here for some time, I was invited back to preach here Sunday morning. And I well remember that Ronald Peachy was leading the singing, and the closing song, would you believe it? He sang, "Blessed be the tie that binds." I guess I'm the only one that was human enough to get the humor out of that. But getting back to my copy so that I know when to finish, there's so much more that could be said. However, I'm very grateful to this congregation and to so many of you wonderful people for your friendship that has been an encouragement and blessing to Emma Jane and me in spite of the many difficult and disappointing times. And God is faithful. He's always good. Thank you very much for your love and patience and forgiveness during the 1960s and even yet today. God bless you all, and God bless the Allensville Mennonite Church until Jesus comes again.
I represent the Living Waters class, and I'm going to talk about the 60s. In the early 50s and 60s, our church had a youth group, or a youth chorus, that was made up of about 35 to 40 members. These were mostly the MYF and the unmarried single people of the church. Chris Peachy was our director. The first trip I remember was to St. Anne, Illinois. We left on a Friday and sang at a church in Ohio. It was where Elmer Yoder had been a pastor. And we spent the weekend at St. Anne, Illinois, where Mark and Pauline Lehman were involved. This was a low-income black community. And I have a couple memories from there. One was in church, you know, we always sang hymns here, but they sang, "He's got the whole world in his hands." And they sang it with gusto, and that was a little different for this plain Mennonite girl. Also, they packed us a lunch because we had to be in Ohio in the evening for another, this was Sunday morning, but we had to be in Ohio in the evening for another program, and they packed us a lunch, and our sandwich was cheese with mayonnaise. That was different to me. We sang at North Clinton Mennonite Church in Ohio. Another trip we made was to Weimar, West Virginia, where Alvin Carnegie was pastor of the Lambert Mennonite Church. And while we were there, when we were getting ready to leave, Alvin asked if some of us girls would be interested in coming to West Virginia to teach Bible school. So Mary Carnegie and Esther Yoder and I, Esther Yoder Lewis, and I spent a couple summers in West Virginia teaching Bible school. This was a little different than the Bible school today. It wasn't just 4 days, it was 2 weeks. And we lived right in with Alvin Carnegie's family. They had 8 children. And in the mornings, we would help with any work that was around there. And I know one year they had chickens that needed killed, so us girls there was another girl and I would cut the heads off, and then we'd clean the chickens in the morning, and Annie would can them in the afternoon while we were studying for Bible school. And then in the evening, we'd go to Bible school at Gladwin, which was about 30-some miles away, mostly dirt road. And we had a van and a station wagon that we picked children up along the way. And one night, Alvin gets to Bible school and he said, "There's no brakes on the van." So after Bible school, Rhoda Nicely and I stayed back with the children. I stayed with the children. Rhoda delivered the children closest to the school, and then her and I delivered the rest of the children, while Mary and Esther and Alvin took the van back home. Now this was in the hills and hollows of West Virginia. And they used low gear and emergency brake. Well, we get back to the house and the van's not there. And we go in and everything's quiet. Here the van's in front of the house. When they turned into the driveway, it went out of gear, and so he went around the house and turned it up to get it stopped. Okay. In 1959, our family moved to Huntington, and we got to know a lot of people along 26. We lived on the first farm right outside of Huntington on 26. And the ladies, my mother would go to some of their church meetings, and the ladies asked whether we'd be willing to have Bible school at Center Union. Center Union was a little community between Huntington and Donation. So our church had Bible school there. There was probably around 100 children or more, and there was 15 to 20 teachers that went every morning. This was every morning for 2 weeks over at Center Union. If you go to that Bible school, or if you go to that church now, it is grown up with weeds. And I had heard that we were asked to take over this or help with this church, and we declined, and often wondered if that was a failed mission outreach. During the 60s was the Vietnam War, and so a lot of the young guys were drafted, and our young man, instead of going to the armed forces, chose alternate service. Fred was drafted in 1964 and chose to work at St. Joe's Hospital in Lancaster. He worked on the psych ward where there was many wild and different experiences from what he was used to. We were married in '65, and I joined him in Lancaster, and we lived in a trailer at the trailer park by Dutch Wonderland, which is now a water park. Daniel Miller was pastor of Rossmere Mennonite Church, and he was our leader or mentor for the 1W guys. And they had 6 children, and we were there lots of times in the evening playing pit around their table. I don't know how they put up with us, because there was a lot of guys would go there in the evening. Their home was always open to us. They were like our mom and dad. And other activities that we had was ball games were really big. Bible study. Sometimes we had skits and different things going on. We made many friends across the state and beyond. We still have reunions every 3 or 4 years, and sadly we lose some of these guys every year. In fact, the first 4 guys who started at St. Joe's are gone. Berlin Eshelman started first, and Fred and Ed Lindecker started. They were the second guys, and then Tony Ziesmer, and they're all 4 gone. So when we have our reunions, there's always someone missing that we're friends with. This was a good experience, and I think young people really lose out on this, because you got out and you got different ideas and found out how other people lived. And it was a growing experience, really. Thank you.
I'm also from the Living Waters class, but I'm going to talk about my 1W experience too. So I was glad Joyce talked about theirs last evening, so that was kind of nice too. But in 1961, you had 18 days to register for the military draft. Today, you're supposed to register with the selective service between 18 and 26. The sooner the better if you want a student loan. So when I was 18, I had the opportunity to register as a conscientious objector, which I think was started sometime between World War I and II. So sometime after that, I started seeing this peachy girl from Allensville. And when I asked her to marry me, and she said yes. All right. So then, you have to make decisions. You have to decide where to live and how to answer this draft question that always was on your mind at that time. So we decided, let's go and get it done instead of settling down on a job, and later we'd have to answer the call anyway. So we did some interviews at a few different places and decided to go to Norristown State Hospital. I started in September, and we got married in October. Later that winter, I received a letter from the draft board to go on a bus to Philadelphia for a physical for the Army, which I passed, and I was already working at the state hospital in Norristown, so that qualified my position, I guess you'd say, whatever. I worked in the dietary department. I went down to the kitchen in the basement to bring up food for 200 ladies. Of course, they had men's side and ladies' side at that time, There was 150 or 75 men and 200 women. So I would bring the food up in big pans and put it in the warmer for some other people to serve. I had to make coffee, take out the garbage, and mop the floor. We always said our 1W experience was a good experience. It was a good way to start our married life. We were away from home and couldn't run home right away, but we could also go home when we wanted to. One winter weekend, we were home, and it was snowing. We were planning on leaving Sunday afternoon for Norristown because I was supposed to work Monday. And it was snowing pretty bad, and we said, let's just wait and leave early in the morning. That way he'll give the people in the road, you know, time to clean up the road. Monday morning we got up and the road was closed. It snowed all night. So I missed that day, but it was okay. Zelda started working at a W.T. Grant store in Christmas decorations department that fall, and at that time, each department was on their own. Later that fall, then there was a secretary that quit, and the boss came to her and asked her to be the secretary, which she really appreciated. She worked mostly 9 to 5, and I worked 10 to 6, and we only had one car, so, you know, we had to wait for each other sometimes, so. But it all worked out. This was a big store. At that time, there was 150 employees, and they paid their employees in cash. So she had to figure out each person's pay and the amount and put it in the envelope. If she came to the last envelope and was short money or over money, she had to go back through, find where the penny was. So then after 2 years, we moved back to the valley. One other thing that I thought about that isn't in the book either, one other thing that I was supposed to do was pest control, I guess you'd call it. Either once a week or once a month, I forget what it was, but I was to spray for bugs or whatever, you know, that might be in an institution. And then one day some workers came in and they were going to tear out part of a wall that was there. And they said, you might want to get your sprayer ready because there was roaches, you know. So they tore out the wall and, oh yeah, there was probably 2.5, 3 inches long underneath in there. So they got a good dose, but you know. Thank you.
If you didn't know, I'm Jim Byler. My dad was born and raised in the Mattawanna area, and my mother was born here, and she had been a member at Locust Grove for quite a few years. Her parents were. And somehow they both were working at Archie and Lizzie Mae King's in this lane. And that's how they got together, and I'm one of the results of that. So I'll give you some background about Marie and I. We moved back from Phillipsburg, where I was a mechanic for Cleveland Brothers, the Caterpillar dealer that had 5 different garages at the time. One of them was in Phillipsburg, and that's where I was hired. When I got out of school, which is now Penn College, it's called, and back then it was possible to have a job in the evening, go to school all day, and get out of school debt-free. Now, I know that's hard for some people to believe now because, well, it's not possible anymore. We moved back to the farm where Marie was born in 1967. We had 2 little boys when we moved back here, and part of our thing was we don't want to raise boys in Phillipsburg. It's a very tough coal mining town, and we had gotten married, and some of them said, "Oh, you're one of those that doesn't wear a ring because you don't want girls to know that you're married." So as a result of that, Marie and I started wearing rings soon. Well, that didn't go down good with some people here because that was considered jewelry. And we'd have been okay if we had done like they do now, where they tattoo the ring on your finger and then that's all there is, you know. So that would have worked good then probably, but we didn't know about tattoos then. We had never moved our church membership. And so when we came back here, we were still members. We attended other places and made lots of friends other places, but we moved back here. And then we were part of the young married group here. And we wanted to have a Sunday school class with the young married and such, but not everybody was in favor of that. And the young married group would have retreats and such, where we had somebody from outside the church come and be an input person. And there were some of the couples in the young married that, in my mind, they were not young married. And so, in looking back, I was trying to think, so why did Joyce and Jess Yoder come there when they were that old? And I came to the conclusion recently that, well, now I know why, because nobody wants to admit they're that old, that they're not going to be part of that. So, okay, Joyce, I understand. And then I discovered that she's really not more than a dozen years older than me, so it's not so bad after all. So, there were lots of things that happened to us. One of the reasons we moved back here was because Marie was a family of all girls, and her dad said, I can't find anybody to help me anymore. Wouldn't you be interested? And we came back on weekends to help make hay and all that sort of thing. And so we had the work ethic. And our second son had a problem. We didn't know what it was, but we knew that somewhere back in the family tree there were kids that were born with a problem, and we didn't know what it was. So if you've never heard of it, it's pyruvate kinase deficiency. Now, pyruvate kinase is an enzyme, and it makes your red blood cells be normal. And with the deficiency of that enzyme, the red blood cells aren't quite normal, and so the spleen takes them out. So, I ain't done yet. Anyhow, so what happened was that they became very anemic, and it was called hemolytic anemia. So, if you've never heard it before, it's actually called the Amish blood disease. And our second son had it. So, moving on to the 70s. We were some of the ones that began wearing wedding bands, which was a problem here in the church with some people because of the idea of wearing jewelry. And at that time, I'm beginning with 1970, and some of the classes were becoming mixed with the youth groups and such. And I'm going to also tell you what was going on in the world somewhat from my point of view, partly because as a boy growing up, I was actually born during the Second World War. There were ration coupons in my name, but I don't remember my parents ever talking about the fact that a war was going on when I was born and the reason why there were ration coupons in my name for sugar and flour and such. And so I'm talking also what happened in the world, not just in the church, because it was a very busy time in both the church and the world around us. So 1970 was the year that the Vietnam War was going on, and there were people protesting against the war, and especially on colleges, students were protesting, and that was the year that at the Kent State University in Ohio, there was such an uprising that they brought in the National Guard, and they shot some of the students, which didn't go down good either, as you could understand. It was also the year that Melania Trump was born. If you don't know who she is, check it out. Put her name into Google, you can find out. And gasoline was 36 cents, so it cost a lot less to drive to church than it does now. In 1971, cassette recorders were becoming fairly common, so one was gotten here at the church by private individuals, and somebody was responsible for recording the services so that if you were shut in or unable to attend, you could get a cassette and listen to it. And they also recorded special services, which took place at the time so that if you wanted, you could get a copy of it. Before that time, we always had those big recorders, you know, with the tapes that ran from one reel to the other and whatnot. And as a boy, I remember seeing or listening to those. In 1971, those were some things going on in the church. And President Nixon started the war on drugs after two popular singers died of an overdose. So if you think about that, Nixon in 71 started the war on drugs. it might be the longest war of history because it's still going on and probably isn't any closer to being one that it was back then. And gasoline was still 36 cents. In 1972, everything was being recorded just like it had been, and it was still cassette tapes. And some of you might have known about some of those other tapes that were in cars and such back then. Yes, my son said, "What is that thing?" So they didn't know about all these things. Anyway, our third son was born, and we named him Matthew. And I've been accused of stealing all my son's hair because, as you know, Matt doesn't seem to have any. And we had decided that we were going to only have 3 children because the first son didn't have the problem, the second son did, and we thought, we'll have the third one. And then Marie had a tubal ligation. If you're enough to know what that is, that's supposed to be a preventive. Well, it didn't work. And I'll tell you a little bit later about what happened. But in June of that year, in 72, the Watergate break-in was. And if you need to look, you can look on Google to find out what that was. But gas was still 36 cents. In 1973, it was a very busy year for the church and for the world, for the country, because approximately 40 members left this church and started another. And a request to use an organ for weddings was denied. And the new Red Mennonite hymnal had come out, but those who wanted to use it were told, well, if you want it, fine, but buy your own. So private individuals funded it, and we ended up getting the new Red Mennonite hymnal. And that was the year that Allegheny Conference, of which Allensville was a member, began pulpit exchange. And so various pastors would trade pulpits, and usually on the same Sunday. And the youth were allowed to have their own class mixed with girls and boys both. That was 1973. The draft ended that year in 1973, and I had never been drafted because I was a student, and that kept people from being drafted, as I was a college student then. Then Marie and I got married, and marriage kept a person from being drafted. Then when we had our first child, that kept me from being drafted. And then we moved back to Belleville to farm, and that kept me from being drafted. And none of this was actually intentional, but that's the way it was. So I was free to fly. In 1973, I learned to fly, got a private license, one of those things that I've never regretted in my life because there's nothing quite like flying. And if George Mueller talks sometime, you can ask him about flying. Anyway, President Nixon was sworn in for his second term, and he actually had a landslide election. And the oil embargo happened because the OPEC producing nations said, you know what, we need more than $3 a gallon for a barrel for crude. $3 a barrel, that's what they were getting. So they said, we'll not sell any more to the United States. And those of you who can remember, by the end of that year, oil was $12, so it worked. But gas was also going up too. And that same year, the Supreme Court overturned state laws which banned abortion with the Roe versus Wade thing that happened in the Supreme Court, which is still there today and still being an issue. The World Trade Centers, those 2 towers, which had a problem in 2001, they opened that year for business. And former President Johnson died, and gasoline had risen to 39 cents. In 1974, Raymond Peachy, the bishop here, ended his duties as bishop, and a request for wedding band ceremonies in the weddings was denied, and organs for weddings was approved, but the organ had to be gone before Sunday morning. couldn't be in here. And Glenn Eshelman, who some of you know that name, he came to the area and showed beautiful pictures of scenery and had it to music and scriptures and all that sort of thing. And his work later became Sight and Sound Theater, which many of you have seen things there. And our fourth son, Sean, was born in June. And he had the problem. So Marie's mother was upset that we wouldn't have as many children as possible. And we didn't quite agree with that in light of the fact that one of ours had a problem. So when we had the fourth child, yes, he had the problem too. So he had to have his spleen taken out, which was the remedy. But the anemia thing has followed both of our sons who have that all their lives. And sometimes if they had the flu or something of that sort, they actually had to have a pint of blood to keep them going, because their eyes would turn yellow and all that sort of thing. So, President Nixon resigned on August 9 over his cover-up. He didn't do the actual bad deeds, but he covered up what his people did, breaking into the Watergate apartments, which they broke into the Democratic National Committee's headquarters. And so Gerald Ford became president, and he right away pardoned Richard Nixon, which some think is the reason why Gerald Ford was never reelected. Whether it was or not, I don't know. And gasoline had gone up to 59 cents a gallon. In 1975, Tim Peachy was licensed as pastor here. It was part of the ongoing thing with pastors. And the Vietnam War ended with the South surrendering to the North, which was what the United States had spent many lives and years trying to keep from happening. And gasoline actually came down a bit, 57 cents a gallon. In 1976, things were reaching out a little bit more. The Eastern Mennonite Seminary's men's chorus came, and they presented a program here at Easter time. And in the real world, Apple Computer started. And if some of you had stock in it, well, yay for you, because it's worth a lot more now than it was then. And Jimmy Carter was elected president, and gasoline was again 59 cents a gallon. In 1977, Tim Peachy was ordained here after having been licensed in 75. And in that same year, the largest plane crash in history happened in the Canary Islands. Some of you may remember, where two 747s on the ground ran into each other, and 583 people were killed in one plane crash. It's one of those things that airplanes, I kind of remember stories about them. And if you were an Elvis fan, he was found dead in his room at 42 years old. And gasoline had jumped to 62 cents a gallon. In 1978, the World Conference, Mennonite World Conference, was held in Wichita, Kansas, and some people from here actually went there. I think, if I remember right, Betty Hosted was one of those. And the first GPS satellite was put into orbit, but was mostly used for military use. And the Dow Jones average that year was 893 points, and if you are someone who follows that, last week it was 26,907.37. Has grown a bit since then. Oh, and gasoline was 63 cents a gallon. In 1979, from my perspective, not a lot of things happened. There wasn't a lot of activity. So what I did was look, and I found that Barb and Sheldon Peachy were married that year, in March. So for them, it was probably a big, exciting year. I hope it was. And Lester and Shirley Peachy, so it must have been a year of Peachies or something, because they were married that year too, in October. And the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident. And if you don't know what that is, you can look it up in Google. I have flown my airplane right in over top of the cooling towers and looked down in there and thought, boy, that's ugly. And if just a brief thing is, a circulating pump failed, locked up, which things happen. And because of that, one of the reactors overheated, and that wasn't near the problem as it was with people not knowing what was going to happen, because there was this rumor that if a reactor ran away because it didn't get cooled, it would melt down and make a hole all the way to China, which was the China syndrome. Well, in 2016, Marie and I were in New Zealand, and we were exactly the same coordinates in the southern hemisphere as we are here in the north. So if that thing would have melted all the way through, it would have maybe come out in New Zealand instead of China. So that's just fake. And that's when the year that the Iran hostages were taken in Iran, when the Shah was ousted and his people, I'll call them his people, weren't happy with things. And so they took over the embassy there and took all the people hostage, and they were hostages for over 400 days. And because of the failed rescue attempt that was done during Jimmy Carter's time, that's supposedly the reason why he was never elected again. And gasoline was 86 cents. So if you're thinking about what it costs to come to church, gas is only $2.89 now, so it costs a lot more than it did back then.
Thank you to Jim and to each of you for sharing. And at this time, we'll take a 10-minute break, and there's some coffee in the basement. And if you could come back about 10:40, that'd be great. Thanks.